28 March 2022. This will be our final lecture on Martin Luther King's famous letter, and it will also be the final lecture before the second exam. The second exam is Thursday, 31 March. The exam will begin at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it will end promptly at 9:20. So you have 80 minutes to complete the exam on Thursday. So make sure you get that on your calendar. If you log in late, you're just going to have less time to take the exam. So be ready to go at 8 o'clock. Okay, we're going to finish the letter today. We are up to paragraph 21. We've got a long way to go. Let's get started and see how far we get today. I'll try to finish the letter, but I can't guarantee it. Okay, here is King's 21st paragraph. He says, I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail to do this, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is merely a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace where the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substance-filled positive peace where all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it may be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must likewise be exposed, with all of the tension its exposing creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion, before it can be cured. So let me turn now to my notes on this paragraph. This is the bottom of my page 14. And by the way, earlier in the previous paragraph, paragraph 20, King had said that he must make two honest confessions. In this paragraph 21 may be the second confession. It's simply not clear. Be that as it may, King points out that law and order exist not as ends in themselves, but, quote, for the purpose of establishing justice, unquote. Without justice, law and order become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. The tension that exists in society is merely a phase, a necessary phase, in the transition from negative peace to positive peace. As for who created the tension, King denies that he and his followers did so. And here's what he says: we merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. King ends the paragraph with an analogy between a boil, which is a pus-filled sore, and injustice. So he's comparing these two things, a boil and injustice. Both need to be exposed to the natural medicines of air and light in order to heal. Note that King refers to, quote, the air of national opinion, unquote. This shows that his ultimate audience was not the 8 Alabama clergymen, but Americans in general. So ostensibly he's addressing 8 clergy members from Alabama, but ultimately he's addressing the whole country and maybe the whole world and posterity, not just people who were then alive, but people in the future who may not even be alive yet. All right, paragraph 22. King says, in your statement, you asserted that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated the misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to his will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see, as federal courts have consistently affirmed, that it is immoral to urge an individual to withdraw his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest precipitates violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. My comments? King replies to the objection that his actions precipitate violence. King thinks that this is illogical. Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Unquote. It's a case of blaming the victim. King gives two other analogies, one involving Socrates and the other Jesus. He says that society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. All King and his followers are doing is vindicating their civil, specifically their constitutional rights. If others respond to this with violence, then they, not King or his followers, are morally and legally responsible for it. And then I have in my notes a picture of a scene from Birmingham. You can see police officers using powerful hoses on the protesters, on the marchers, on the demonstrators. It's been said that these hoses were so strong in their force that they ripped bark off trees. Imagine that. Imagine pointing a hose at a tree and watching the bark fly off. That's pretty powerful. And these people had no protection from the hoses on their bodies. Okay, King's paragraph 23. I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth of time. I received a letter this morning from a white brother in Texas, which said, all Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But it is possible that you are in too great of a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. Unquote. So that's what a person in Texas wrote to King. He calls him a white brother in Texas. Here's King. All that is said here grows out of a tragic misconception of time. It is the strangely irrational notion that there's something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively, notice the typo there, it should be DE, or constructively. Time can be used either destructively or constructively. I'm coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of and persistent work of men, and of course women, willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. That's another of King's famous phrases. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now, an elegy is a poem for the dead. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. Okay, that's King's paragraph 23. Here are some of my comments. King discourses on the myth of time. You may think of this as King doing philosophy of history. White moderates believe that he and his followers are moving too fast. King thinks that this betrays, quote, a tragic misconception or misunderstanding of time. Time is morally neutral. There's no guarantee that the mere passage of time will make things better. As King puts it, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men and women willing to be co-workers with God. King and his followers, he implies, are doing God's work. They are active participants, not merely passive observers. In a memorable phrase, King says that the time is always right to do right. He ends the paragraph with a metaphor about quicksand and solid rock. Now, I told you at the outset that King's letter is filled with allusions, imagery, metaphors, figurative language, analogies, and so on. This is just one of many. And I think that's partly why it's such a beautiful work of art, because it's not just written in literal language throughout. It's filled with these wonderful images that inspire and motivate. All right, here's King's paragraph 24. This one takes up almost a whole page. You, remember, he's speaking at least directly to the 8 Alabama clergymen. You spoke of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of the extremist. I started thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of 2 opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency made up of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, have been so completely drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and of a few Negroes in the middle class who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because at points they profit by segregation, have unconsciously become insensitive to the problems of the masses. So that's the first force in the Negro community. The other, or second force, is one of bitterness and hatred, and becomes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up over the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. This movement is nourished by the contemporary frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. It is made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incurable devil. I have tried to stand between these 2 forces, saying that we need not follow the do-nothingism of the complacent or the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. There is the more, here's one of the corrections King made after this letter was typed. There is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I'm grateful to God that through the Negro Church, the dimension of nonviolence entered our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, I'm convinced that by now many streets of the South would be flowing with floods of blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who are working through the channels of nonviolent direct action and refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes, out of frustration and despair, will seek solace and security in Black nationalist ideologies, a development that will lead inevitably to a frightening racial nightmare. Well, let me make a few comments on this paragraph, and then I may add some that aren't in my notes. King, in good philosophical fashion, replies to the objection that his actions are extreme and that he is therefore an extremist. In fact, he says, he occupies middle ground between, on this side, complacency, and on this side, bitterness that verges on violence. Notice, these are the two extreme ends of the spectrum. King situates himself in the middle. He's denying that he's an extremist. He's claiming to be a moderate, a middle-of-the-road person. He says that there are two complacent groups within the Black community: those who are beaten down by oppression to the point where they have adjusted themselves to segregation, and those in the middle class who have, quote, become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The bitter members of the Black community gravitate to groups such as Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, who have concluded that the white man is an incurable devil. King says that he has tried to stand between these two forces. He does so by advocating love and nonviolent protest. King believes that his approach is the only one that will stave off violence. Here's how he puts it. If this philosophy had not emerged, I am convinced that by now many streets of the South would be flowing with floods of blood. Note that King foresaw the long, hot summer of 1967, 4 years later, in which there were 159 race riots in American cities, such as Detroit. See the Wikipedia entry on Long Hot Summer of 1967 for details. Here is a scene from Detroit. And you can see there a gathering of people, police officers in the foreground, and what looks like a conflagration in the background of burning buildings and so forth. Now, I grew up in Michigan. I was 10 years old in the summer of 1967, and I remember hearing about it. I was a big baseball fan. The Detroit Tigers in 1967 were on the verge of going to the World Series, which they did in 1968. And they not only went to the World Series in 1968, they won it. And that World Series victory had the effect of bringing white and Black people together in Detroit, in Michigan, and around the nation. People forgot their disagreements for a while and rooted for the Tigers. It was a very moving thing. And there were, of course, Black players on the Tigers, such as Willie Horton, Gates Brown, and others. And they came together as a team, and they showed that whites and Blacks can work together for common objectives. Okay, back to King, paragraph 25. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it. Consciously and unconsciously, he has been swept in by what the Germans call the Zeitgeist, which means spirit of the times. And with his Black brother of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, he is moving with a sense of cosmic urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. I think that should be promised rather than promise. Recognizing this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand public demonstrations. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations. He has to get them out. So let him march sometime. Let him have his prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Understand why he must have sit-ins and freedom rides. If his repressed emotions do not come out in these nonviolent ways, they will come out in ominous expressions of violence. This is not a threat. It is a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. But I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channelized or channeled through the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Now, this approach is being dismissed as extremist. I must admit that I was initially disappointed in being so categorized or characterized. King was shocked that people were calling him an extremist because from his vantage point, he sees on both sides that there are other groups in the Black community. There are people who are so beaten down that they're unwilling to do or say anything. They've resigned themselves to being segregated forever. And at the other extreme are groups that are resentful and prone to violence, disposed to use violent methods to make changes. And King is saying there's a middle path, a path that's designed to reform rather than revolt, rather than overthrow the system. It's designed to work within the system for changes that will move us forward toward a more just society. So King always saw himself as a moderate, a middle-of-the-road person, not as an extremist. Okay, paragraph 25. Whoops. I'm sorry. I hadn't yet read my paragraph 25. Let's read it now. King says that oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. Everyone, including the American Negro, has an urge for freedom. People all over the world are moving with a sense of cosmic urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. Note the religious allusion here, promised land. The white power structure would be well advised to recognize the many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations of blacks. If repressed emotions do not come out in nonviolent ways, such as marches and so forth, they will come out in ominous expressions of violence. Now, this may sound like a threat, but King says that it's not. He denies threatening anyone. He says it's a fact of history. If you study history, you will see that groups of people who have been repressed eventually emerge, and often it's in an explosion of violence. So if you don't want that explosion of violence, maybe you should give further thought to negotiation with people like King. King wants to channel the discontent of the Black community through the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Here, by the way, is one of those freedom buses that King mentioned. You'll see that it says NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the bus has the label Freedom Bus. And you can see a group of people there, including at least one white person. Okay, so here's paragraph 26 from King. But as I continue to think about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist in love? Here he quotes Jesus, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you." Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Quote, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? Quote, "I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus." Was not Martin Luther, for whom Martin Luther King Jr. was named, Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do none other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? Quote, this nation cannot survive, half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Not some men, all men. So the question is not whether we will be extremist, but what kind of extremist will we be? Will we be extremist for hate, or will we be extremist for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must not forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality, and thusly fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. So, after all, maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Now, King is shifting his focus, isn't he? In the previous paragraph, he expressed surprise that anyone thought of him as an extremist. And he suggested that as a matter of fact, he's not an extremist, but a moderate. But now in this paragraph, King is saying, wait a minute, I suppose I am an extremist, but not an extremist filled with hate. I'm an extremist filled with love. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So let's read what I wrote. In paragraph 24, King had denied being an extremist. He now says that he doesn't mind being considered an extremist. This puts him in good company with Jesus, with Amos, with St. Paul, with Martin Luther, his namesake, with John Bunyan, with Abraham Lincoln, and with Thomas Jefferson. The question, King says, is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremist we will be. Blah, blah, blah. King and his followers are extremists for love. Maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Paragraph 27, King says, I had hoped that the white moderate would see this. Maybe I was too optimistic. Maybe I expected too much. I guess I should have realized that few members of a race that has oppressed another race can understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those who have been oppressed, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. I am thankful, however, that some of our white brothers and sisters have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still all too small in quantity, but they're big in quality. Some, like Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, Harry Golden, and James Dabbs, have written about our struggle in eloquent, prophetic, and understanding terms. Others have marched with us down nameless streets of the South. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of angry policemen who see them as dirty, and then there's that N-word, lovers. They, unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. Now that's a powerful paragraph. King says here that he's disappointed in the white moderate, whom he had hoped would support his cause. He says he should have realized that few members of a race that has oppressed another race can understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those that have been oppressed. But some white brothers and sisters have supported his cause, and King mentioned several of them by name. I think for posterity, King is saluting these individuals. He's deeply appreciative of what they've done to help him and support his movement. He says some of them have marched with him, some have languished in jails with him, and they've all faced the brutality of angry policemen. Note King's metaphor at the end of this paragraph. He speaks of antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. So the metaphor is a disease. What is the disease? Racial segregation, which means separation of people by race. And King thinks there's an antidote for that disease, a way to cure it. And he thinks that his civil rights movement, based on nonviolent civil disobedience, is that antidote. Okay, fortunately for us, because time is moving along, we can start combining a few of these paragraphs because they're very short. I'm going to read paragraphs 28 through 31, and then I'm going to have a comment on all of those paragraphs together. So here we go. King says, "Let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I'm not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand on this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders of this state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it for as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders, including him. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. Now, anesthetizing in this context means unfeeling. In spite of my shattered dreams of the past, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern serve as the channel through which our just grievances could get to the power structure. Now, there is an insertion here. Let me look at the final page. If you look at the final page of this typed up letter, you'll see that there's supposed to be an insertion. In other words, a sentence was left out. And here is that sentence, and this is where it's supposed to go. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed. Okay, so that's paragraphs 28 through 31. Now, let's turn to my comments on all of those paragraphs. King says he's also disappointed with the white church and his leadership. He had thought that he would have the support of the white church. Indeed, that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of his strongest allies. A few of them were supportive, to be sure. But some, quote, have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. Many others have remained silent behind the anesthetizing, i.e., unfeeling, security of stained glass windows. King uses the word disappointed, or a variant of that word, 4 times in these 4 paragraphs. It is clear that he is confused and hurt by the lack of support from his fellow clergymen and their flocks. Note that King uses the term freedom movement to refer to what others have called the civil rights movement. He is seeking freedom for African Americans, whom he believes to be caged or confined by unjust laws, segregation, and bigotry. He wants to liberate his fellow black citizens in the South, and indeed across the country, but mainly in the South, where those Jim Crow laws restricted or constricted the movements and activities of black citizens. Remember, it was the 14th Amendment in 1865 that conferred citizenship on the newly freed black slaves in the South. They were decreed to be not only citizens of the United States as a whole, but of the states in which they resided. They have dual citizenship, like every other person in this country. You are a citizen of your state and of your country. So King is saying that black citizens are confined or constricted, and he's trying to liberate them legally and morally, and maybe even in some cases physically. Okay, I'm going to combine the next 2 paragraphs and comment on them together. 32. I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right and the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sideline and merely mouth pious irrelevances and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, quote, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern, unquote. And I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular. Paragraph 33. So here we are moving toward the exit of the 20th century with a religious community largely adjusted to the status quo. The status quo is, of course, the way things happen to be, the way things currently are. Standing as a taillight behind other community agencies rather than a headlight, leading men to higher levels of justice. Okay, here are my comments on those 2 paragraphs. King here continues his criticism of the white church and its leadership. He says that worshipers in white churches are told by their religious leaders to obey court decisions such as Brown versus Board of Education back in 1954, which desegregated public schools around the country. Religious leaders tell their parishioners to obey court decisions that require desegregation, not because it's morally right and not because the Negro is your brother, but because it's the law. Some religious leaders believe that it's not the church's business to involve itself in worldly affairs. King calls this a completely otherworldly religion. He uses a metaphor of taillights and headlights. The church should be a headlight, leading men to higher levels of justice. In other words, the church is following rather than leading the way. King had thought that the church would be a leader, the church would lead the country to desegregation or to racial integration and to justice. Instead, he's disappointed to find the church merely lagging behind other groups, such as King's group. The church should be a headlight at the front of the procession, not a tail light merely following along. Okay, we're moving along. I think we'll make it. I'd like to get done within an hour and 20 minutes. We're about halfway there, according to the time. So let's read paragraph 34 now and my comment. King says, I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at her beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlay of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over again, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave the clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when tired, bruised, and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Now, let me, in my comments, I will tell you a little bit more about those individuals King just named. Here's my comment on paragraph 34. King waxes poetic. In fact, I started to get a chill when I began reading this paragraph because King is starting to wind down the letter. And like a musical composition, the letter builds and builds and builds to a grand finale or climax or coda. So the poetic language starts now. King waxes poetic, talking about the beautiful churches of the southern states with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. He wonders about the parishioners of these churches. Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification, and so on? Now, I can tell you that Ross Barnett was governor of Mississippi from 1960 to 1964. So he was currently the governor of Mississippi while King wrote this letter. And Ross Barnett said the following. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have a quotation from Barnett, but I do have a quotation from the next governor. George Wallace was governor of Alabama at different times, intermittently from 1963 all the way to 1987. In his inaugural address on the 14th of January, 1963, just 3 months before King wrote this letter, Wallace said, quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Those words were uttered by the governor of Alabama, which is, of course, the home of Birmingham, where King was in jail. 3 months earlier, that was the language of the governor of the state, and Wallace was still governor when King was in jail. So those are the individuals he alluded to or mentioned in that paragraph. All right, paragraph 35. Yes, these questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. I love her sacred wells. How could I do otherwise? I'm in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. So that's 4 generations of preachers in the King family. He is the 4th. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and fear of being nonconformists. Okay, my comments? King returns to his theme of disappointment. He used the word twice more. He says that he's wept over the laxity of the church. His tears are tears of love. If he didn't love the church, he couldn't and wouldn't be disappointed in her. He observes that he descends from a long line of preachers. The church is the body of Christ, and it's been blemished and scarred by neglect and fear of nonconformity, of rocking the boat. Okay, King's paragraph 36. There was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period when the early Christians rejoiced, when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were, quote, a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number, but big in commitment. They were too God intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Here are my comments. The church was once a powerful force for change in the world, King says. It was a thermostat transforming the mores of society rather than a thermometer recording the ideas and principles of popular opinion. That's a fascinating metaphor. A thermostat merely records the temperature around it. It doesn't do anything to change whatever the temperature is. It's inert. But a thermostat, which is set by a human being, is designed to change the ambient temperature around the thermostat. So a thermometer is passive. A thermostat is active. It has as its goal to change something. So King is saying that the church should not be a thermometer, it should be a thermostat. It should be active in the world, seeking justice, trying to change things when they're unjust. King says the adherents of the church, many of whom suffered of the early church, many of whom suffered for their faith and works, obeyed God rather than man. They were a colony of heaven. Several ancient evils, such as infanticide and gladiatorial contest, were brought to an end by these determined people. King obviously hopes that the church will bring an end to racial segregation as well. He is trying to motivate the clergy to return to their earlier transformative ways. In fact, I don't have this in my notes, but King seems here to be trying to shame his fellow clergy members to become more active in the struggle for racial justice. He's appealing to their sense of honor and decency and shame. Okay, paragraph 37 from King. Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often vocal sanction of things as they are. My comments? The contemporary church, as compared to the earlier church, is often a weak, ineffectual voice. Instead of transforming society, it supports the status quo. Now, this assures the white power structure that nothing will change. It puts them at ease. It reinforces their comfortable nature or situation. And as I said a moment ago, King may be trying to shame the clergy into being a more critical and active force in society. Have you ever heard the expression, the purpose is to afflict the comfortable, not comfort the afflicted, or not merely to comfort the afflicted? In fact, King would probably support both of those. His goal is to comfort the afflicted, those who have been beaten down by injustice, and to afflict the comfortable, right? In this case, the white power structure. So he's advocating both of those things. Paragraph 38 from King. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I am meeting young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. Wow. Comments? King believes that God will judge the church harshly for its lack of sacrificial spirit. He warns that the church is on the verge of becoming an irrelevant social club. He says that he meets young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. One might say that the church, the mission of which is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, has been co-opted by the white power structure. And you might want to compare here a famous saying by Karl Marx that, quote, religion is the opium of the people, unquote. Now, there's some debate about what exactly Marx meant by that. The way I've always interpreted it is as follows. Marx, whose goal was a revolutionary, whose goal was to rebel or to motivate rebellion against what he called bourgeois society, Marx believed that religion had a bad effect, and that was to calm people down. Religion, by emphasizing justice in the next world, de-emphasized justice in this world. Religion encouraged people to accept their fate in this earthly world in the hope that justice would be done in the world to come after their worldly deaths. So Marx was anti-religion because religion told people don't bother working to rectify injustices in this world. True justice will be done in the next world. So Marx was anti-religion, maybe anti-Christian in particular. King, of course, has the opposite view. King thinks that religion can be and should be a force for change in this world. Yes, ultimately justice will be done in the other world, but that's no reason to be complacent in this world, King seems to be saying. Right? We can do justice in both places, here, now, and we can benefit from justice, God's justice in the world to come. Paragraph 39. Maybe again, I have been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to status quo to save our nation and the world? Maybe I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and the hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia with us. They've gone through the highways of the South, on tortuous rides for freedom. That would be those freedom buses I showed you. They've gone through they have gone to jail with us. Some have been kicked out of their churches and lost support of their bishops and fellow ministers. But they have gone with the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. These men have been the leaven in the lump of the race. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. All right, here's my comment. In this metaphor-rich paragraph, King wonders aloud whether organized religion, i.e. the church, is too inextricably bound to status quo to save our nation and the world. He salutes the noble souls within the ranks of organized religion who have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity. These individuals have walked the streets of southern cities, going on tortuous rides for freedom. Tortuous, by the way, means twisting and turning. It doesn't mean torture. That's a different word, torturous. Tortuous means twisting and turning. And they have gone to jail. They've been kicked out of their churches. They've paid a personal price for their devotion to freedom. And King salutes them for it. King says that these men have been the leaven in the lump of the race. Now, I did a little bit of research. He may be referring to Galatians 5:9, which says that, quote, a little yeast leavens or causes to rise the whole batch or lump of dough. A little yeast leavens the whole batch. One memorable phrase in this paragraph is that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Here's an image showing freedom riders being beaten in Birmingham, Alabama. You can see the man in the right foreground looking at the cameraman. You see that they've got someone on the ground beating on him or her. Okay, paragraph 40. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are presently misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, that's Massachusetts, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our foreparents labored in this country. That's one of the changes King recommended. Our foreparents labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of brutal injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation, notice the typo there, and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Notice something interesting. Jefferson refers to the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence. What are those words? Well, here are the opening words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King is saying that those and the rest of the Declaration are majestic words. It's sad today that people feel compelled to drag Jefferson down, to vilify Jefferson. Yes, Jefferson was a slave owner, and we may judge him for that, either by his standards or by our standards. That's a rightful judgment. But let's not dismiss the Declaration of Independence just because it was written by someone who owned slaves. Because the words I just quoted to you are majestic, inspirational. Right? Jefferson was a fallen human being. He was frail. He was weak. He didn't live up to his own stirring words. So let's not throw the words out with the person. If we must throw Jefferson out and take his statues down, let's not do the same to the Declaration of Independence, which is an inspirational, majestic, and indeed wonderful document. It's one of the great documents of freedom in the history of the world. And that the people at the time weren't fully living up to its majestic words is simply a sign of frailty and weakness. Okay, enough preaching on my part. Let's continue. King says, let me repeat the last part of this. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Now here's my paragraph 40 comment. King says that he has neither despair about the future nor fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham. He believes that his movement will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. He points out that there were blacks in America, specifically Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619, before there were Pilgrims in America, Plymouth, Massachusetts, via the Mayflower in 1620. And there were blacks in America before Jefferson wrote those words in 1776. And I quote the words there in my notes. Black slaves built the homes of their masters, including Jefferson's beloved Monticello. King says that if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. The sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. King believed that God was on his side. Here's a plaque dedicated to freedom riders, and you can read that plaque on your own. Okay, almost done. Paragraph 41 from King. He's going to start winding down now. If you may start getting chills as I do as I move along. I must close now. But before closing, I'm impelled to mention one other point in your statement that troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would observe their ugly and inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you would watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls. If you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys. If you will observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department. Okay, my comments. King begins to wind down. He mentions one other point in the statement of the clergyman that troubled him profoundly. And I'm not sure I need to read all of this. I'm doing a lot of quoting. He mentions mistreatment in the jail and so on. Here's an image of police dogs being used against black citizens. It's a stirring image, isn't it? You'll see the young man leaning forward, bracing himself for the attack by the dog or dogs. I don't know about you, but when I see a dog coming after me, when I'm riding my bike, for example, it's terrifying, especially if the dog is big, like these dogs. This young man is fearless. Look at the expression on his face. It's not as though he doesn't know or didn't know what was about to happen. He's standing there, bracing himself. What an act of courage. Okay, King's paragraph 42. It is true that they've been rather disciplined in their public handling of the demonstrators. He's talking about the police. In this sense, they've been rather publicly nonviolent. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation. Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. So I have tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. In other words, the end, however good, does not justify the means. Have you ever heard that expression? But now I must affirm, by the way, that word not was supposed to be now, it's a correction. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or even more so, to use moral means, such as nonviolence, to preserve immoral ends, such as segregation. Maybe Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather publicly nonviolent, as Chief Pritchett was in Albany, Georgia. But they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of flagrant racial injustice. T.S. Eliot has said that there's no greater treason than to do the right deed for the wrong reason. Okay, my comment. King says that the police have been rather disciplined, i.e. nonviolent, in their public handling of the demonstrators. But the goal of this discipline was to preserve the evil system of segregation. King taught his followers that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends, but insisted that it's just as wrong, or even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. The police, he says, used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of flagrant racial injustice. Now, my comment. Note that King rejects the oft-heard dictum that the end justifies the means. To the contrary, he would say, certain means, such as violence, are unjustified, however good the end. Let me give an example of this. Some members of the animal rights movement or the animal liberation movement have come to the conclusion that violence against person and property is justified if it's calculated to end the way animals are treated in laboratories and factory farms. In other words, they conclude that the end justifies the means. The end, which they take to be good, is ending mistreatment of animals. And they have come to the conclusion that whatever it takes to bring about that end is justified, including violence, blowing up laboratories, firebombing the homes of researchers, blowing up factory farms, buildings, and so on, or even injuring the factory farmers. King rejects that. King would say that you should work toward changes non-violently. Right? Certain ends are simply not acceptable, no matter how good the end or objective may be. King concludes the paragraph by quoting the Harvard-trained philosopher, poet, and literary critic T.S. Eliot. It stands for Thomas Stearns Eliot. He published under his initials T.S. Eliot. Eliot said there's no greater treason than to do the right deed for the wrong reason. In other words, the police officers were, in some cases, restraining themselves, but their goal was to promote the end of racial injustice or segregation. Here's another image of a police dog being used against a citizen. This appears to be an older man, and you can see even the police officer is backing off to get away from the dog's lunge. It's a dramatic photograph from the civil rights era. You can see all the people watching this incident in the background. Okay, paragraph 43. King says, this is a moving paragraph, I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of the most inhuman provocation. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose, facing jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman of Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride the segregated buses and responded to one who inquired about her tiredness with ungrammatical profundity. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be the young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thusly carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. All right, my comments. King sings the praises of those who have suffered for the cause. He says that one day the South will recognize its real heroes, people such as James Meredith, the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi, and an elderly black woman who's unnamed, who refused to ride segregated buses. These courageous and disciplined individuals faced jeering and hostile mobs, and so on. All of them stood up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. King ends the paragraph with a metaphor about those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers. Now here's a picture of James Meredith. By the way, he's still alive. He was born in 1933. He's older than my mother. He's going to be 89 years old at some point this year. Here he is on his way to register for classes at the University of Mississippi. He's being escorted by federal marshals, not state or local police, such as Bull Connor. Federal marshals were there to escort him to prevent violence toward him. You can see he's dressed in a suit and tie, well-groomed, carrying a briefcase. Imagine the bravery. People around him are jeering, spitting on him, calling him names, racist epithets, and he was brave enough to attend class and put up with all of the vitriol. That's James Meredith. And he went on, I believe, to get his degree. You can read about him, I'm sure, on Wikipedia and other places. Okay, a couple more paragraphs and we'll be done. Paragraph 44. King says, "Never before have I written a letter this long, or should I say a book. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you're alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers?" All right, my comments. King apologizes to the clergyman for the excessive length of his letter. Voltaire, who lived long ago, a Frenchman, famously wrote in a letter to a friend that if he had had more time, the letter would have been shorter. Think about it. If I had more time, my letter would be shorter. The point is, when you write a first draft of a letter, you tend to be wordy and you're redundant. If you have a chance to revise it, you'll typically get rid of stuff that is redundant or unnecessary. And that's what King seems to be saying. Sorry, Sorry my letter's so long. If I were at a desk reviewing it, I would shorten it. He says he wrote the letter while alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell. Okay, paragraph 45, just 2 to go. He's going to really wind it up now. If I've said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I've said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. All right, my comments. King begs for forgiveness if he's overstated or understated the truth. His aim, one might say, is to get things right for posterity's sake. He doesn't want to say more than the truth will allow, but he doesn't want to leave anything true out either, true and relevant to the issue. He must have had a sense that this letter would become, as it has become, an important document in the history of the civil rights movement, which is why we're reading it and discussing it. This letter should be read alongside our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, together with its many amendments, with speeches by Abraham Lincoln, and later by people like John F. Kennedy. This is a very important document in American history. Now here's the final stirring paragraph. I'll try to get through it, but I get choked up sometimes. King says, I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. All right, my comments. King concludes his letter with an expression of hope that he will get to meet each of the 8 clergymen, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. The final sentence is saturated with metaphors. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away. You got the image of clouds moving off, letting the sun shine through. The deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Notice King never lost his love for this country. Earlier, he talked about his beloved Southland, for which he had a particular affection, but he loved his country. He loved the country in spite of its imperfections, in spite of the fact that it failed to live up to those stirring words of the Declaration of Independence. He believed in this country. He wanted to make it better. He believed that his life and work were designed and would eventually make it better. He also knew that he was in great danger. And indeed, he knew that many people hated him and would have loved silencing him. And 5 years after this letter was written, in April 1968, he was killed. I've ended my illustrated guide with a picture of King and his beautiful family. You can see his 4 children there, and his wife, I forgot his wife's name, honestly. I'm thinking Yolanda, but that may be the name of one of his daughters. At any rate, I found a biblical quotation that I think applies to King and his work It's from Matthew, one of the books of the gospel, books of the Bible, one of the gospels. It says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I think that applies to King and his work. Okay, sorry I got choked up there. It always happens. I can't help it. I hope you've learned something from this letter. It did take an hour and 20 minutes exactly, so that worked out well. Some of my comments were admittedly repetitive. I'm sorry about that. Maybe in some cases I didn't need to read King's actual words. I could have probably just read my comments because they quoted King at length. But we got done with it. It took 3 days. Good luck in your studying. I will ask, I think, 3 true-false questions from this letter and 10 multiple choice questions. I'm still working on them, but they'll be done by Thursday. So good luck in your studying. We'll begin a new topic after the exam on Tuesday next week. So have a great day, and I'll see you on the computer screen, if not earlier in class, on 1 week from today. All right, so long.